The invasion of Crimea and the Donbas in 2014 has now been overshadowed by the full-scale war across Ukraine. But understanding the shadowy and obscure ways in which the conflict began and developed prior to 2022 may help to highlight potential risks for a post-conflict order. Russia's hybrid warfare strategy may have played a leading role in igniting and fueling the conflict, but crime and insurgency are intimately connected in the Kremlin playbook. The boundaries between mafia criminality, the security forces, and government are hopelessly blurred in Russia, and nowhere more so than in the occupied territories of Ukraine. The Kremlin is opportunistic and co-opts all kinds of actors, from businesses and gangsters to politicians and educators, as tools and proxies. A Ukrainian victory will not only require the seizing back of territory, but an effort to root out Russian assets, networks, and accomplices, and roll back propagandist media and the penetration of the occupied territories by criminal elements. I'm joined by world-renowned academic Mark Galeotti today to unravel this murky and terrifying Ruskii Mir. Welcome to the Silicon Curtain podcast. Please like and subscribe if you like the content we produce. It will really help increase the popularity of our content in YouTube's algorithm. Our materials are now being made available on popular podcasting platforms as well, such as Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Mark Galeotti is an author and academic, by training an historian, but in practice an interdisciplinary scholar with interests encompassing politics, criminology, security studies, international relations, and anthropology. He is a specialist in transnational and organized crime, security affairs, Russian politics, Russian history, intelligence, and security. Mark, welcome.
Good to be here.
Fantastic. Well, let's start with Gorbachev and Dugina. I know this news has been overshadowed by what's happened yesterday, but let's have a look at these two significant deaths in the Russian world. They would seem to be opposites, polar opposites as people, and the ideologies they held. But does the passing of these two people herald a new era of strife, terror, and conflict in Russia?
I wouldn't want to say it marks, because that implies that somehow it's going to lead to that. I think it's more that it's really sort of symbolic. I mean, look, okay, Gorbachev, he was an old man, and it's not so much that his death is a particular surprise, though obviously it's also a point of great sadness for many of us. But it was more quite interesting the degree to which, in some ways, it really brought to bear the extent to which, in some ways, Putin is the anti-Gorbachev. That although they're both leaders of their own countries, and they obviously both believed in their own countries and wished to push forward their own respective national agendas, Gorbachev ultimately was someone who believed in ideals, and he was actually willing to sacrifice his country in the name of his ideals. Whereas Putin is, well, in some ways, he's also willing to sacrifice his country in the name of his ideals, but rather his ideals are very much about himself. And primarily, Putin is a nationalist of a very sort of old-fashioned kind. And from Putin's point of view, one of Gorbachev's main flaws, and this is one of the many reasons why the men did not get on particularly, is precisely that Gorbachev ultimately would not use violence. He would not use force to preserve the state. And that was a sort of a signal weakness as far as Putin is concerned, whereas we would regard it actually as a sign of moral strength than anything else. So in some ways, I think sort of Gorbachev's passing really just simply reminds us of the characteristics of that man and the contrast with Putin. The case of Dugina is more interesting in that this is a woman, daughter of this pretty barking mad nationalist philosopher, Alexander Dugin, who is sometimes in the West claimed as a Putin's brain or the kind of Rasputin behind Putin. There's actually no evidence that Dugin's ideologies actually influenced Putin, but rather that it was sometimes useful for the Kremlin to take advantage of people like Dugin to justify what they wanted to do. I mean, for the Kremlin, all the various ranges of philosophies and ideologies out there are in some ways a buffet from which you sample, I'll have a little bit of nationalism, a little, teeny little pinch of ethno-fascism just to sort of perk it up, and so forth. So, I mean, in that context, I think that although we don't really know precisely what the story is behind the murder of Abdulgina, was it a hit based, trying to kill her father? Was it about her? Was it from some Ukrainian agents, as Moscow has inevitably claimed, or domestic terrorists, or a business rivalry? Who knows at the moment? But again, I think what it highlights is it brings us to bed frankly the moral vacuum at the heart of the present sort of Putinist state. That, in a way, again, people like Dugin, however much they are, in my opinion, fairly ghastly human beings, they nonetheless believe something. And the Putin regime uses them when it's handy and then ditches them when not.
And during the eulogies for Gorbachev, I think it's quite interesting. Two things really kind of jumped out at me. One of them was that in terms of preserving the greater Russian world, perhaps there wasn't such a difference between Putin and Gorbachev. Gorbachev didn't want the Soviet Union to collapse. He didn't want necessarily all the countries, like the Baltics and Ukraine, to secede. But his, I would say, Russian imperialism was of an unconscious kind, whereas Putin's is extremely self-conscious. But the other thing that really jumped out, of course, is that we know Putin has absolutely no respect for rule of law. In fact, he's eroded and destroyed rule of law practically in the 22 years he's been in power. And yet I did hear some people say that actually Gorbachev did have a strong, almost idealistic belief in law and truth. I don't know if you think that's an interesting point or not.
It is, and in some ways we can actually sort of loop the two together, because again, from Gorbachev's point of view, yes, he wanted to preserve the Soviet Union, which he ultimately thought was worthy of being preserved, but only if it could be reformed. But again, this is the thing, he was trying to hold something together. And again, law comes into it in that, when it came down to it, he was ultimately willing to allow portions of it to secede, when they clearly sort of wanted to. I mean, again, it wasn't something that just had to be held together at all costs. Whereas actually Putin is trying to reassert control over territories that are no longer parts of the Russian Federation, and clearly do not want to be part of the Russian Federation, in defiance of international law, domestic law, and in a way what we might think of as kind of basic human law. I think this is the thing. I mean, it's that there are those leaders. I mean, look, all leaders, to become, a national leader, you have to have an ego the size of Siberia anyway. And you have to believe in your own rightness, your own greatness, and that you are the best person for your cause. So, of course, there's going to be that similarity. But again, it's that question of what are you willing to burn in the name of that? When it came down to it, Gorbachev ultimately, precisely because of his concerns about the importance of, you mentioned, it was a long road to it, but nonetheless, in belief in truth. This is a man who, after all, started as a very conventional Soviet apparatchik, member of the party and so forth, and who in due course would actually turn against the Communist Party in the name of the sort of wider cause. But again, ultimately driven by that sense that there is a belief that there is something bigger than him. Whereas I think it's clear that as far as Putin is concerned, nothing is bigger than him. So the very fact that at the moment you have, Russians fighting and dying in an imperialist war within Ukraine, and yet when very recently in Vladivostok, Putin was asked about, basically, what is Russia losing? And as far as he's concerned, Russia is losing nothing at the moment, because it's no skin off his nose.
And that came out at the same time as, I think this morning, there's been a leaked document from the Russian Minister of Finance, which suggests that actually the Ukrainian estimates of around 48 to 50,000 Russian dead is actually extraordinarily accurate. This document is based on compensation paid out so far, and if you calculate the amount of compensation, it comes to about 48,000 killed in action. And then to classify that as nothing to worry about, it's quite chilling, isn't it?
It is. Look, there has to be a certain caution about that particular document, because there is a very, very active information war going on. And in some ways, it is precisely that these figures seem to tally so correctly to the Ukrainian estimate which gets me slightly concerned, because we do know that there's been quite an issue with the non-payment of benefits to both serving, living, wounded, and then the families of dead servicemen. I mean, again, it's depressing for me, and particularly. I mean, look, I did my PhD on the Soviet war in Afghanistan back in, the war that was fought from 1979 to 1988, and it's amazing how many of the blunders and the just sheer inhuman treatment of their own people that we saw back then in late Soviet times that is being repeated now, many years later. So, we have to treat that particular document with some caution. But still, look, even if it's just 35,000 dead, even if it's more than 50,000 dead, I mean, in either way, not only is that kind of a horrific statistic, but you're absolutely right to just simply brush that off as being, well, no real issue of concern. I think demonstrates that degree to which sort of Putin has internalized this notion of l'état c'est moi, that essentially, he is the state, and so long as it's good for the state and for him, then any cost is acceptable.
And a last word on Gorbachev. I mean, that attitude is the kind of one you'd expect to come through someone who's risen up through the ranks through the sort of Chekist hierarchy. That sort of cold calculation is what you'd expect, actually, and we see it obviously in abundance in Putin. Gorbachev also came from those ranks and rose up through that same kind of party structure and through the sort of KGB hierarchy. But for someone to emerge with some sense of morality and rule of law, it's actually remarkable that someone like Gorbachev emerged at all, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, Gorbachev was never in the KGB. I mean, he was a party functionary who rose up, absolutely. But in some ways, I think it's almost more that actually the trajectory talks about the person rather than the other way around. I mean, it's not that before he went into the KGB, Putin was some wide-eyed innocent or naive idealist. Quite the opposite. I mean, this is we know even from his rather disreputable childhood, basically, he ran with street gangs, he got involved in fights and such like. And it seems to be that he joined the KGB not because he wanted to be the sword and shield of the Communist Party, but because it was basically the biggest gang in town. And I think this is the problem. I mean, a lot of the people who joined the KGB did so precisely because they reckoned it was a good way to, basically make money, gain power, and essentially sort of work your way into the sort of what we would think of almost as the social elite, if you happen to be, born as an outsider. So yes, I mean, they're very different people, but I think in some ways what it was Putin's experiences first in the KGB, and then as the kind of, fixer, I suppose one would put it, in the 1990s for the Leningrad and St. Petersburg mayor's office, sort of dealing with all kinds of disreputable business people, gangsters and the like. I think what that did was hone those characteristics that were there. But yes, on the other hand, I mean, it is quite extraordinary that someone like Gorbachev could rise within the system. But even then, there were signs from an earlier point that he was unusual for a party hack. Of course, he had ambitions and so forth, but nonetheless, one of his best friends at university was the Czech Minaj, who ended up being one of the kind of reformist figures who was very much associated with the 1968 Prague Spring liberal movement. Gorbachev and his wife were the only Soviet party officials who actually traveled in the West independently as tourists. So not just simply on an official delegation, but they actually they poodled around Italy and so forth. They got to see what the West was really like. And the fact that they actually were interested in doing that, again, I think just, early signs that this is someone who's a little bit more open-minded than your standard stolid Soviet apparatchik.
That's unusual, isn't it? Because people traveling abroad almost always did it with a purpose. And almost always you had to be some kind of paid up party member to even be allowed, a passport, external passport, travel abroad. So that, I didn't know that. That's absolutely a sort of extraordinary fact there. Now,
clearly he was trusted. I mean, I think that's the thing. I mean, if he had been someone about whom they had any ideological questions, he wouldn't have been allowed out. But this is the whole point. He used that trust. And indeed, he demonstrated it was worthwhile because he then returned home. He didn't try and defect or whatever. But precisely because he was trusted, he actually had more room for maneuver than someone who was obviously disgruntled.
And possibly as an idealist, he quite possibly wasn't questioning the system in quite as, let's say, a sort of strategic or intellectual
No,
way
quite.
at that point, maybe. Well, let's turn to current events, because clearly in the last couple of days, there have been advancements on the battlefield. That is going to put huge internal pressure on Putin, which we've seen with this supposed, again, another document we have to be cautious about, but the St. Petersburg deputies who have put forward a document suggesting the impeachment on treason charges of Putin. I don't know if that's genuine, but it seems quite surprising if it's true. And as we know, Putin, when he's cornered with that street fighting instinct, he tends to escalate rather than de-escalate. So are we on the verge of some kind of escalation? For instance, the winter gas war. What's Putin going to try and do to get himself out of this corner?
Yes, well, I mean, domestically, I mean, I think we can be pretty safe in saying that Putin is not about to be impeached, regardless of what some individual local regional parliamentarians may want. I think that, I mean, you're right that his instinct is to escalate, because for him, this is an existential struggle. It's not simply about Russia, it's about his own political future. He really has staked his position, but also his place in history on the success of this particular gambit in Ukraine, and it's clearly going disastrously wrong. I mean, I think that said, we should also realize that in his own terms, Putin is a deeply unpleasant, but nonetheless rational actor. Some people say, oh, he's mad, he's a sociopath or whatever. Well, for me, these are almost cop-out. They're more or less saying, this is why we can't possibly try and predict what he is, because what he's going to do because of this. I mean, as we saw with his very first drive to try and seize Kyiv. I mean, clearly this was a serious operation. We had the flower of Russian special forces pretty much decimated there. Major military convoy sent and such like. It didn't work. He could have chosen to escalate, but instead he realized, no, this isn't going to be sort of the pushover that I thought. I'll pull back, reformulate a strategy, and focus instead on the Donbas and the southeast. So, this is a man who, when he sees alternatives, he will actually sort of rationally work it out. But yeah, he will be thinking, how can I push the situation to my advantage? I mean, obviously, we don't know what's going to happen on the battlefield, but his options are distinctly limited. I mean, essentially, he's already cut off gas now to Europe. And with Europe now saying they're going to impose a price cap on oil, it's unlikely they'll be selling any oil to Europe either. Now, that last point is much less of a big deal for the Russians, because oil is a lot more easy to move around. And gas, basically, unless you can liquefy it, which requires special plants, you actually just simply can only just pump it along a pipeline. And therefore, your markets are really defined by where your pipelines are. Whereas oil can be put in a tanker much more easily and moved around. So oil, they're selling all over the world at the moment. So, in a way, on the battlefield, Russia does not have lots of extra troops. I think this is the thing. Even if Putin decided to call this special military operation, as the official term is, actually a war, and institute a general mobilization, it would take about 3 months from calling that mobilization to actually having the troops fully equipped and ready on the battlefield. Now, 3 months, that takes us into the middle of winter. Essentially, you're not going to be doing anything in the middle of a Ukrainian winter on any sort of major scale. So he doesn't really have much scope to escalate in conventional military terms. He doesn't have any scope to escalate in terms of the economic war with the West. And although people sometimes talk about the risks that he might turn to tactical nuclear weapons or the like, I see no signs that the Russians are contemplating that. I think they realize that would be a real game changer. That's the kind of thing that would stop the West from just simply thinking of this as being something about helping Ukraine win and getting the West to start thinking seriously about regime change.
And possibly China as well. I mean, that would burn bridges potentially with China.
Yeah, exactly. The Chinese would be very worried and unhappy with that. I mean, they're still not particularly happy with this war as is, especially because they have huge investments in Ukraine. But yes, I mean, so for all those reasons, really all Putin can do now is dig in. I mean, from his point of view, and again, this is what came out of his very bullish comments recently in Vladivostok, where he was saying, look, Western sanctions, are entirely pointless and meaningless. They're doing no harm at all. They're actually making Russia stronger and so forth. Obviously, that is nonsense. Sanctions are having a serious impact, but they're a long-term, they're a slow burn weapon to be used. But his hope is not just to kind of rally the troops at home, but is also to try and shake the unity and the conviction in the West. Because the thing that would be most devastating to Ukraine is actually if the West decided to scale down its support. Its support, obviously, militarily on the battlefield, but also essentially the Ukrainian economy is on life support and is being kept afloat precisely by Western financial assistance. So, I think from Putin's point of view, he's hoping that a hard winter gets Europeans in particular thinking, is this really worth it? We've already seen big protests, for example, in Prague. And that is what might give him some kind of a victory.
I mean, how organic are those protests? Sorry to interrupt, because that's a lot of people there. But I'm always suspicious about pro-Russian protests, how, let's say, organic the origins or organization of those are.
I think we tend to overplay the actual capacity of the Russians to really have an impact on the ground in terms of their disinformation, their agents of influence, and so forth. What they can do is kind of work with the grain. I think in some ways that we should think of them almost as radicalizing forces, that what they can do is take people who are disgruntled, a little bit disgruntled, and make them angrier. But I think the thing is that actually, I think particularly these kind of scale of protests and some of the other protests that we've seen in Germany and elsewhere, I think that, they reflect a sense that Ukraine is a long way away. And why are we suffering? And there is a sort of, I think, quite a pervasive mood that says, look, after COVID and everything else, we were looking forward to the rebound. And now not only are we having to pay ridiculously high energy prices and so forth, but we're also seeing huge amounts of money being sent to Ukraine. And it's not that they have anything against Ukraine. And it's certainly not that they have anything against Russia, in favor of Russia. The Czechs have all kinds of bad blood of their own with the Russians.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It's more that just they're unhappy with the fact that money is being spent there, not at home. If you think most recently, Boris Johnson, one of his closing acts as prime minister was to pledge £1 billion of additional support for the Ukrainians. Well, £1 billion will buy you 2 hospitals. I think it's that kind of contrast that really is what's getting people concerned. It's not they have anything against Ukraine or want to support Moscow. It's they're thinking, yeah, we could use that money at the moment. Thanks very much.
That's right. And of course, as the fuel bills come in, as the temperatures drop, this kind of pressure will start to feel very real to people. So that's kind of worrying. Well, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is also about a topic which doesn't get an awful lot of attention, and where you still get an awful lot of sloppy phraseology in the media, and that is DNR and LNR, the Lugansk and Donetsk so-called People's Republics. And you still get a lot of people using phraseology that somehow suggests that the insurrections in those territories were organic, came from the local population, and Russia was maybe involved, but not the central player. But I saw one of the reports that you, I think, were working on, which suggests that actually the role of the GRU, criminality, and all those kind of hybrid forces really kind of came to bear and were instrumental in what happened in 2014.
Yeah, absolutely. We have to realize that there's a key difference between what happened in these regions and what happened in Crimea. Crimea was clearly, Putin himself said, he basically told his guys, okay, time to take back Crimea, and a major multifaceted operation that involved everything from special forces to subversion to military intelligence to criminality and so forth was deployed for that purpose. And originally that was going to be the end of it. It was just about taking back the Crimean Peninsula, that on the one hand was strategically vital to the Russians because it was where the Black Sea Fleet was based, but also an area that pretty much every Russian regards as rightfully Russian. It was until the 1950s part of the Russian Federation. I remember I was living in Moscow in 2014 when the vote on annexation was held, and scarcely got a wink of sleep that night, because I was living on one of the big ring roads, and all night long people were driving round and round the ring roads, blowing their horns, waving flags, cheering, and so forth. It's a real point. And and this, as I said, it includes people who were deeply opposed to Putin, but still thought that was right. Yeah. However, first of all, I think that the annexation of Crimea happened so easily that it almost created that sort of sense of forward momentum.
Mm.
Well, gosh, if it was that's easy, what else should we be looking for? Secondly, that the Russians used a lot of nationalists and volunteers, in their Crimean operation, often really just simply to kind of mask the presence of actual Russian forces.
Mm.
But then once they'd consolidated their grip on the peninsula, they had no real use for these people. A handful of the more efficient ones got hired into the police or the military, but basically it was, well, thanks very much, guys. Now just go away.
Yeah.
So you had
a bunch.
so you had a bunch of disgruntled nationalists with guns.
Mm.
And of them, a certain number of them were looking over the frontier, because in southeastern Ukraine, there was a genuine mood of dissatisfaction and concern about what was happening in the country.
Mm.
The revolution of dignity, the Euromaidan, there's this rising that had taken place against the government of Yanukovych, was very much seen as a West Ukrainian driven phenomenon. And there were new laws about, against, for example, the use of Russian, which up to then was one of the state languages of Ukraine. And so you had a bunch of people who, on the whole, spoke Russian, thought of themselves as ethnic Russians, even if they regarded themselves also as Ukrainian citizens, had all kinds of close family and business ties over the border. And look, on the whole, these were not people who wanted independence from Ukraine, but they were people who were just concerned about that sense that suddenly they are going to become second-class citizens, and they were thinking about, well, we need to find some way of asserting ourselves and getting more autonomy. And into that, you then had this mix of, volunteer Russian nationalists who just simply sort of went over the border, just thinking that they were going to help their brothers, whether their brothers wanted it or not. Local opportunists, many of whom were indeed gangsters themselves, who saw an opportunity to basically turn what we think of as street power, shall we say, into real political and economic power.
A little like the 1917 revolution, in effect,
well,
where you have
that kind of chaos.
Yeah,
but exactly, but with no Bolsheviks.
Yes.
I mean, it was that kind of chaos without a single unified fighter. And there were elements in Moscow, elements even in the Kremlin, who thought, no, we should be involved. And I don't get the sense, in the first months at least, that Putin was actually saying, yes, destabilize the Donbas and do it. But on the other hand, I think he felt, and this is a kind of classic Putin move, is, well, let's just see what happens. I'm not going to commit myself so that I can always just simply deny any role if need be. But on the other hand, something interesting may come of it. And it was seen as a way of putting pressure to bear on Kyiv. At this point, Moscow was basically trying to sort of force the Ukrainians to actually not wrench themselves from Russia's sphere of influence as they saw it. But then, what happened is the whole thing escalated. And after a certain point, the Russians thought, well, we don't want sort of our supporters to be totally sort of wiped out. We'll begin to give them some weapons. You had the terrible disaster of the MH17 shootdown, a civilian airliner shot down by a Russian-supplied surface-to-air missile fired by separatists. And I think after a certain, it's almost like Russia then got sucked into it. And after a certain point, they just thought, well, look, like it or not, we're involved in this, so let's get committed. In the summer of 2014, they actually started sending in, serious amounts of regular troops to support the separatists, who otherwise were going to be wiped out by the authorities. So again, it was this interesting case of, and there's actually it's a very good new book that's coming out shortly called Hybrid Warriors, by a, at the time, journalist called Anna Arutunyan, who did a lot of reporting on the ground. Which very much emphasizes this point that, in those early days, no one had a grand plan. There was just a whole bunch of different opportunists from the Kremlin down to the back streets of Donetsk, who were just seeing what they could make of it. And then in due course, because Putin didn't have the guts, frankly, to pull out and say, no, this isn't going where I want to go, he let himself get sucked into it, and then, the rest is history. But precisely, it's a war that was kind of being generated by all kinds of different actors, including gangsters, and criminality became baked into these structures, also as a way of just keeping them funded, because they were basket cases; they were not real states at all, and so to a degree, organized crime, turning a blind eye to that, or even facilitating it, became a way of actually keeping their economies going.
And the economy is an interesting point, isn't it? Because a lot of the propaganda makes a play on, the repression of Russian language, the repression of not ethnic Russians, Ukrainians with connections, more closer connections to Russia. I have to be very careful with my language here. But actually, parts of Luhansk and a bit of Donetsk actually economically were quite vibrant, weren't they? So you've got this additional pressure that actually these are up-and-coming regions. You have people who are starting to, make money, quite a bit of money, in official capacities and good businesses by being part of Ukraine. But you've then got this emotional pull of Russia. But of course, once the occupation or once the insurgency began, all that economic progress was wiped out, wasn't it? So you also then have that bubbling discontent of all that potential wealth and businesses being destroyed by that process.
And also huge degrees of disparity. I mean, you're absolutely right. There were pockets of real economic dynamism. But also, I mean, to a large extent, this is, after all, coal mining region. You also had the real feelings of, massive poverty and immiseration, and that sense that sort of history was not on their side. Look, as someone who for a while lived in Stoke-on-Trent, Newcastle under Lyme area when I was teaching at Keele University, in some ways, perversely, it did feel a little bit like the Midlands. That you've got areas which definitely have been sort of left behind by economic change and of acutely aware of it. And then you also have pockets of prosperity and dynamism. And I think, this is the thing. I mean, it's not easy to characterize these areas. And to be honest, look, it's not like one could actually say that this was a natural and organic revolution. Absolutely. It was more that just simply some general discontent at the status quo got harnessed. And as you say, in the process, what could have been done was trashed. I mean, these areas, if Putin had been truly Machiavellian and had truly wanted to harm the new Ukrainian state, in 2016, he'd have just simply handed these regions back to the Ukrainians and said, basically, do have fun with your parlous and under pressure national budget, trying to reintegrate these populations, rebuild these damaged areas, and so forth. Clearly he wasn't that Machiavellian. But the point is, these are now areas which whoever controls them, for generations to come, they will bear the scars of this war.
And in terms of the sympathy, but clearly there would have been, significant cultural and social sympathy with Russia prior to this year, prior to February. It's going to be interesting, isn't it, to see that if Ukraine does take back those territories, what is people's attitudes now and how will they react? Because we can't know what people are really thinking and feeling there. There's no sociological research or objective process that you could have in a totalitarian society, and indeed those occupied territories, which are almost like a sort of mini version of the 1930s, I believe, these days.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Look, clearly, even if we go back to 2014, 2015, there was not any kind of a clear majority in these regions for either joining Russia or actually just simply declaring full independence. So it's one of the reasons why precisely they never held any such referendum or whatever. I mean, they held quote unquote elections, but they never gave people that kind of straightforward choice. Because whereas Crimea, look, obviously the referendum that was held in Crimea was not a free and fair one. It was held under the shadow of the Russian gun. But nonetheless, even if it had been absolutely fair, totally monitored by international observers, etc., I'm still very much of the view that a strong majority would have voted in favor of annexation.
Not 99%, but maybe 70%.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Whereas I think it's a very different situation in Donetsk and Luhansk. And there, I think, for most people, frankly, you just did not dare question, because the local authorities were essentially, vicious collections of thugs more than anything else. And people did disappear into the infamous basement of the administration building in Donetsk and so forth. I mean, this is definitely much more what we kind of associate with sort of global South coup regimes rather than anything else. So in those circumstances, on most people, just basically either they got the hell out, and then there was quite a sort of a shift of particularly younger, fitter people out. leaving a much older, more pensioner sort of population left, people who didn't feel they could just up sticks and leave. And I mean, you know, in that process, yeah, I mean, I think this is an area that you know, has suffered tremendously, and I think, you know, to this end, you know, I think we should have a lot of sympathy for the people of the Donetsk and Luhansk region, because I think they are the victims of this process. And when this war ends, and assuming that, as is, you know, more likely than not, Kyiv does regain these territories, so much will depend on how Kyiv treats them. And the trouble is here, there is clearly a very, very sharp ideological divide within Kyiv and the Ukrainian people. There is obviously a sort of, on one hand, people who absolutely appreciate the need for pacification in a positive way, reintegration, demonstrating to these people that they are not going to be scapegoated. And others who are angry and who precisely, I think, unfortunately, will want to have a sort of a thorough, as they would see it, cleansing of the region. Because look, a lot of people, for example, they work for the government in the LNR and DNR, not because of any ideological need, but the point is that because people need to eat and people need to look after their families. It doesn't make them, I mean, again, you know, this is in parallel to what happened after World War II in Germany. You know, it doesn't mean that everyone who necessarily had a party card believed in the Holocaust.
No.
And that's the sort of, but you know, it's a question of how sensitively you handle that. And I think that will very much depend on how, you know, will very much condition how people respond. You know, if they're treated badly, then this will continue intergenerationally to be a problem. If they're treated well, then I think many people will be delighted to be integrated into a West-looking and, you know, rebuilding Ukraine.
I mean, especially those who fled from Mariupol and all the towns that have suffered horrifically. I think even those who are, you know, where Russian is their primary language, I think the sort of cultural and social sympathy has evaporated. But the challenge has to come, doesn't it? Because I've spoken to lots of people, and I've got my, you know, my straw poll of social media, which is not scientific in any way. Occasionally, you'll get someone with a fairly nationalistic point of view, a sort of anti-Russian language point of view. But they're a tiny, tiny minority of all the millions of posts that we look at. However, I think there are a lot of Ukrainians now who will speak fluent Ukrainian as their primary language, but also will speak fluent Russian, that they're actually disavowing Russian. They're actually making a conscious decision not to speak Russian because it's painful to them. I mean, that's going to be quite a challenge as well, isn't it?
It is. It's very much so. And again, I mean, look, reconstituting shattered nations is always hard. And in part, that will depend on money, resources that we've provided, some kind of almost new Marshall Plan in due course to rebuild Ukraine, which again is going to come on the backs of Western taxpayers who are going to have to accept that as the price for winning a war without putting their own fighting men and women into harm's way. But it also depends on policy. I mean, I think, again, there is unfortunately a minority, but a vocal and forceful minority in Ukrainian politics who are very much of that sense that, in a way, Ukrainianness must be forced upon these people rather than encouraged. Look, this war absolutely has been a total state-building, nation-building moment for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine, which for so long has not actually been a proper country, in the sense of a truly unified one. There have been multiple failed attempts at state building. Well, in some ways, the irony is that Vladimir Putin is the true father of the Ukrainian nation.
And over hundreds of years, not even just.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, but this is it. I mean, that's why, I mean, so I have a tongue very firmly in cheek, suggested that the Ukrainians should be putting up statues to Putin, because he's the one who's truly forged that nation together with this terrible war. But again, it's a question of, okay, for those people in these kind of reconquered territories, you know, is this going to be a process of enforced or encouraged? I still am optimistic enough to think it's going to be encouraged, but that is going to be a real political struggle that the Ukrainians themselves are going to have to resolve in due course.
And as with Ireland and the troubles there, it's going to very much depend, isn't it, on the pace and scale of rebuilding, investment, regrowth of the economy, rebound. And speaking of a lot of Ukrainians, I sense a lot of optimism that they're on the threshold of a cultural renaissance. And if these things happen, if there's both the cultural and the economic boom, which hopefully will happen with the support of the EU, US, and other allies, then this may well sort of soften, diminish, or push into the background those more extreme nationalist elements.
Very much so. And in some ways, one can look at, okay, it's a very different scale and different context. But if one looks at what happened in, for example, Estonia, which has quite a substantial Russian-speaking population, and frankly, there's obviously a much greater difference between the Estonians and the Russians in Estonia than between primarily Russian-speaking Ukrainians and primarily Ukrainian-speaking. But even so big gap. And look, up until 2014, there were real concerns about this Russian-speaking minority, that they were unhappy. They were, they felt that they were being discriminated against. I mean, there's some truth. I mean, that they had to learn Estonian in order to get civil service jobs. And I don't know. Again, tongue in cheek, I would say that being forced to learn Estonian does count as a bit of a human rights violation, given that it's, for me, I think, extraordinarily impenetrable language.
Is it Finno-Ugric? I have no idea.
It is. It's one of those. It's one of those three: Finland, Estonia, and Hungarian. Those three. And so they were doing what everyone does in a democracy, which is you find a fault line issue around which you can cohere some kind of a constituency. And then you use that to pressurize the center for resources. And that's essentially how democracies work. And there was real concerns about that. And then Crimea happened. And all of a sudden, things got very real. It's all very well protesting and saying that your Russianness is under threat and such like, when it's just simply a useful political posture. But now that you're actually in a position where Russia now is basically saying, well, fine, where there are members of the Ruskii Mir, then maybe we will be asserting Russian power. Well, look, these people, I mean, particularly if you live in Narva, which is the main Estonian Russian city, it's literally just across the river from.
I was about to say, if you've ever renewed your visa by going from Ivangorod to Narva,
exactly. And so, a lot of them travel back and forth. So they know full well the difference in quality of life. And all of a sudden it got very real. And, if you're faced with a real choice, would you like to be a citizen of the Russian Federation or a citizen of a dynamic, democratic, liberal European Union state? They know exactly which side they want. So not only do we get sort of
costs, yes.
Yeah, I mean, massive diminution in the militants of the Russian speakers in Estonia, but also apparently many more volunteering to join the military or kapo, which is the security police, precisely because they think, oops, no, actually, if push comes to shove, I'm happy being an Estonian after all. Thank you very much. So again, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that practical prospects and that sense of, are you willing to, basically, are you being offered inclusive membership within something which looks a lot better than the alternative, I think will go a long way to helping sort of sweeten the pill for those.
Loving your family at a distance, isn't it? You might respect and admire your brother from afar, but you don't want him moving into your house, and that's a little bit like what Putin would be threatening to do with the Ruskii Mir.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, moving into your house and claiming ownership of it.
Yes, and having extremely poor, habits. Now, let's turn to Russia itself, because what we also know from the experience of the de-radicalization that happened in the 50s in Germany under occupation, that didn't happen overnight. That took several decades, and I've heard some estimates range up to 3 decades to really weed out the kind of Nazi messaging. In fact, it had to take an entire generation to die away, and a new generation to be born into the new education system. What on earth is going to happen to Russia, where we've had not 20 years, but we've had at least 15 years of really deep, toxic propaganda, and not just on TV, through publishing houses, through education, through a whole range of different media. This toxic propaganda has seeped extremely deeply into people, and it's built upon tropes that were already in place and myths from the Soviet era as well. What on earth, how do we uproot that?
Well, firstly, we don't. I mean, ultimately, it'll be for the Russians to do so. I mean, what happened in Germany precisely was based upon A, occupation, and B, massive amounts of economic assistance to basically rebuild the country. Neither of those are we going to be seeing in Russia. But also, I think the task is very different. Look, yes, Russians have been faced with this barrage of toxic propaganda, but frankly, Russians have been living within propaganda states for more than a century, and they are well aware of the need to almost maintain two sets of thoughts. That there's the official and what you actually believe. And if we look at how quickly the Soviet era sort of fell apart, so we shouldn't assume that this is something that they are genuinely inculcated in. I'm always find it interesting that Putin tends to have these sky-high approval ratings from the 60s up into the 80s. The sort of approval ratings that any Western politician perfectly happily sell their own grandmother to have. And yet his trust ratings are usually down in the 30-somethings. Now, okay, on one level, that implies that there's a large portion of Russians who approve of Putin but don't trust him, which sounds a bit strange. But what it really reflects is the approval rating is because, in some ways, Putin has become an icon of Russia, and there is no alternative. There's no opposition. There's no rival. So, more or less, it's just going to be a way of saying, are you a patriot? But actually, as it were, that's Putin, the national icon, the avatar of Russia. Putin, the politician, well, really, his approval ratings are in the 30%, because that also tracks very closely to United Russia, which is the main sort of pro-Putin political bloc. And I think it says something that, that the very fact that the elections have to be so heavily rigged, the fact that the last vestiges of independent media have been squeezed out, the fact that you can't just simply log on and see BBC or Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty without using a VPN to bypass the state's information controls. If you are genuinely popular, then you don't have to do any of that stuff. This is not in any way a genuine democracy. And I think the degree to which, look, Russians can feel themselves to be patriots, most Russians are, but then again, most people regard themselves as patriots of their own country. Some of them do hold some, I think, of troubling views about Russia's place in the world and such like. Though there are people who would say that Britain still does and France certainly still does and so forth. Losing the habit of empire. To play devil's advocate,
though, I don't think you'll find anyone advocating the reconquering of former colonial territories in Britain, even if they might have a fairly chauvinistic attitude about Britain. And in fact, English nationalism is fairly unconscious, as it were. If you're looking at it from the point of view of Welsh and Scots, you get offended quite a lot by the English lack of sensitivity. But no one's advocating for the reconquest. However, 2014 showed that Russians might distrust Putin's propaganda when it comes to local political issues, things like bad roads, etc., transport, corruption. But when it comes to feeding that deep desire to be a superpower, to be an imperial entity, that still plays on very deep-seated desires, doesn't it, within the Russian?
I challenge that. Look, I said Crimea was basically unique. Crimea, I'm trying to think of a kind of equivalent. Because it's close by. It's almost like as if in the 1950s Gibraltar had been sort of just by fiat handed to Spain. But even then, Gibraltar, I think, looms rather less high in our national consciousness. But I think this is we should not universalize from that. Crimea was one thing. And in part, the reason why Crimea was popular was essentially it was bloodless. 5 people died in the whole operation. And that the Crimeans themselves were clearly keen on it. So, the people could think of it as a liberation. But even if one looks at the Donbas, even before the current invasion, the very fact that the Russians continue to lie all the way up to now about the presence of their forces there. Now, it's not that they continue to lie because they thought they'd convince us. It's not that they actually thought, well, one more lie and the West will say, oh, gosh, we got that wrong. We're awfully sorry. It's actually they were lying to their own people. It's precisely because the Kremlin knew, not least because the Kremlin is the most assiduous user of opinion polling within the Russian Federation. The Kremlin knew that this was not a popular war. This would not be a popular war. Russians did not care about the Donbas. Yes, they kind of cared in very sort of loose terms, but in terms of, are you willing to see your boys go and fight and die? No, not at all. And likewise, if one looks at the current war, at the moment, still a large proportion of Russians, when asked, are willing to say, yes, I support the special military operation. But you've got to bear in mind, I mean, some of them genuinely do, full stop, absolutely. Some of them do because they're basing it on what they see on telly, where they're told it's a very limited surgical operation to stop a neo-Nazi regime from committing pogroms. Others, look, they just know what's the safe answer to give when someone with a clipboard asks you this politically very problematic question.
Or calls you up, even worse, they know where you live. If they
precisely. So, for all those reasons, I mean, I think we shouldn't easily just assume that, in fact, Russians are saying, rah, rah, go and, go and take over. And it's not actually as if they want to see Ukraine under Russian control. There is that sense that this is a fraternal nation, that people want good relations with Russia. So I think for all these reasons, look, I'm not going to say that every Russian is a liberal pacifist, not at all. There is still, strong elements of racism, strong elements of still a certain kind of, that rather toxic kind of nationalism that says that sort of we deserve a place in the sun. But look, this is an inevitable post-imperial hangover. And it happens, and as I said, I mean, I'm not trying to be glib, but if one looks at the UK and France, one of the reasons we do still have a rather sort of exalted sense of our place in the world, and we're willing to spend money on it and so forth, because we still regard ourselves as having that, and that's after many more decades, and having had an empire which was nicely, conveniently far away. I mean, it's much more traumatic when your empire is on your borders and there's a lot of ethnic Russians still there. So I think for all these reasons, this is part of a process going out.
And of course, a lot of the propaganda. I mean, this is an area where I guess I have views about NATO that I'm pretty sure that Putin and his elite objectively would have understood that NATO was not going to invade, that it had a minimal force in Europe, that it did not represent a huge threat. But it's very convenient, isn't it, to be able to use that for internal repression, to use that for internal coercion and control.
Yeah, and it's also, though, because it's not so much about, do you think that the mighty Belgian war machine will be unleashed upon the Russian Federation? It is also, it's that sense of disrespect. There is this belief, and look, people argue as to whether it's accurate or not, but nonetheless, I think it's a genuinely held belief, amongst Putin and his circle, that promises were made to Russia that NATO would not expand, and then NATO did. And so it's not just simply about whether or not this represents a threat. And, I think there are differences of opinion, but yeah, if you speak to the professional soldiers, then they're clearly going to say no. But it is more that sense of, look, what this says about how the world is willing to challenge Russia, to demean Russia. I mean, again, it's time and again, if one looks at Putin's speeches, he very much frames it as, it's a strong message of victimhood here. Again, which is another one of those differences with Gorbachev. It's that message that basically says, look, the outside world did bad things to Russia, so we had no choice but to respond. And yeah, in part, that's a handy line to more or less say, this is why we're doing what we're doing. But I think it also just genuinely represents this really kind of corrosive sense of insecurity and dissatisfaction, which is at the heart of Putin's message.
And if you take his, going back to his street fighting days, if someone disrespects you, if someone, puts you into a corner, you come out fighting. And I believe I've seen Julia Ioffe and others talk quite compellingly about that mentality he's got. And then if you combine that with the fact that he's been in power for 22 years, is it not the case that he's become to personify Russia, that he is the personification of the entire country? The two concepts almost maybe merged in his mind. The state and him are almost one and the same to an extent.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, I think that there's an interesting dichotomy. If at the end of his second term as president, when he sort of handed over power kind of to his prime minister Medvedev in order to satisfy constitutional term limits, it's clear that he was toying with the idea of leaving power, that he thought, well, I'll just sort of almost as a caretaker, and I will be the prime minister under Medvedev, may just make sure that the boy does good,
Mm.
and then leave. If he had done so, the interesting thing is, I think that actually history would be relatively kind to him. I mean, an unpleasant man who did unpleasant things,
Yes.
particularly in Chechnya, but on the other hand, someone who did actually bring Russia back from the brink of anarchy that would have been in no one's interests.
You'd have history essays, wouldn't you? Good or bad, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
That's his legacy.
I don't think there'll be many people asking that question now.
No.
You know, but I think this is it. I think part of the reason why he came back, I mean, there are all kinds of practical reasons. There's failures of Medvedev's. There's actually some failures in Western foreign policy. But it also, I think it's that sense that he could not ultimately let go, that he fell foul of that classic politician's hubris to think of himself as the irreplaceable man. And exactly, I think this is it. I think he has seen himself. And in some ways, you say it's this kind of merging of Russia and him. I think there's almost that sense of, and again, this is very much just kind of reading between the lines and things, but almost like that sense of the kind of that he's trying to make Russia what it ought to be, that the moment Russia doesn't really deserve, but nonetheless he can bring him to that stage. And yeah, I mean, I think this is it. This is why, in his mind, you know, going back to how, you know, where we started this whole business of, oh, well, Russia has lost nothing. It is that sense of, for the idea of Russia, then Russians may have to pay a great deal in blood and treasure, but that as far as he's concerned, it's worth it, and he knows best.
My last question really is how this ends. And of course, there's a million other questions I wanted to ask you about how he rose up in the 90s, how the secret state sort of merged with the mafia. And that was a period, I think, when you were in Russia, and I was studying in Russia at that time in St. Petersburg, and extraordinary to watch that happen. But I think because we're running out of time, I'm just going to chuck that question over to you. Where is this going to go in the next weeks, months? Is it going to drag on into next year, or does Ukraine now have the momentum to finish this quicker? And then what on earth happens in Russia?
So that's just the last question. That's all. I'm sure I'll be able to quickly polish that one off. No, look, I mean, it's clear that the Ukrainians are making, as we speak, some very impressive wins on the battlefield. But they're not going to, in my opinion, have what it takes to be able to steamroller all the way. There is no military victory to be won. I mean, without in any way demeaning what the Ukrainians have done, which is quite extraordinary. But nonetheless, the Russians actually, when they get their act together, they can be very dogged in the defense, and we shouldn't write them off by any means. It's a classic thing about Russia being not as strong as people fear, not as weak as people hope.
And they can endure endless hardship, which is something history tells us.
Well, yeah, they can endure endless hardship when the state stands behind them with a loaded pistol, you know, as the alternative, which, you know, let's be honest, at the moment the state is.
Yes.
So I mean, I think unfortunately I can't see an end out of this conflict, this war, this side of New Year, and quite possibly for a long time after that. At the moment, the two sides are just so far apart. There's no meaningful grounds for any negotiation. Putin, again, I think because Putin does feel that his career, his future, his legacy are all on the line, he needs sufficient gains that he can spin as a victory commensurate to the cost. And there's no sign of Russia being able to win that. So in a way, it all becomes dependent on the arithmetic of the battlefield. And also on the West maintaining its will and unity sufficiently to actually keep supporting Ukraine. And that means that, look, I mean, even if, let's say, the fighting ends in a year's time, the conflict, the broader conflict with Putin's Russia will continue. Sure, there'll be some degree of sanctions relief because the Russians will demand it as the price of any peace deal. But we're not going to go back to business as usual. There's not going to be some reset. And so I think that, you know, realistically, we are in, for want of a better word, a Cold War with Russia, so long as Putin is in the Kremlin.
And indeed his successor. I mean, his successor, there's no reason why.
I am obscurely and unfashionably optimistic. I don't think his successor will be a liberal.
No.
But if one looks at the next political generation below, remember, you know, Putin, he's going to be 70 in October. His circle, they're all between the ages of about 6, well, with the exception of Defense Minister Shoigu, they're all between the ages of about 68 and 74. If one looks at the younger political generation, and I'm not talking striplings, I'm saying late 50s, early 60s, they are basically ruthless, pragmatic kleptocrats. They aren't they don't seem to be informed by the same kind of bitterness of the true Homo Sovieticus generation like Putin, the people who really were in the middle of it when the Soviet Union collapsed and they feel they need to kind of claw back some of that position. These are people who basically want to be able to steal at home, bank and spend abroad. And the thing is, look, we in the West, we know how to deal with kleptocrats. We do it all the time. These are people who actually will have a very good pragmatic interest to improve relations with the West, because that's where the money is. That's where the opportunities are. Yes, they are not going to be Democrats at home. It's not going to be a sort of a fine time of reform quite yet. But nonetheless, I think that will mean that they will essentially scapegoat Putin, because I think Putin will go when he dies or is incapacitated. I can't see him standing down willingly, unless you can find a successor that he really feels he can trust. And, you know, that might prove to be a mistaken assumption. But anyway, sort of, you know, they can basically dump the blame on Putin. And we in the West will probably be desperate for some kind of a deal. So we'll probably be willing to make compromises.
It's a palace coup, far more likely than revolution. If
yeah, absolutely. Look, street power only really succeeds when the regime is already divided and demoralized. But there's the interesting thing. The people who are the primary sort of enforcers on the streets are the National Guard. The National Guard are also in the thick of the fighting and taking some very heavy losses because they're not frontline combat troops. And look, I mean, I follow some National Guards or social media channels and so forth. And I mean, it's clear there's a lot of real anger, a real sense that they were just used as cannon fodder. And that's more general. I mean, there's a lot of people within the system, people who are not in any way liberals, but who nonetheless think either that, A, this was a bad move, or else they didn't have a problem with invading Ukraine, but did have a problem with it being done so amateurishly, incompetently, and corruptly.
Yes.
And I think, again, this is it. When you start to alienate the men with the guns, that's when, again, I don't think anything's going to happen imminently, but that means that when there is some kind of a challenge, you know, if we do see trouble on the streets and people are being forced to make the decision, then they might well not be thinking, let's back Putin to the hilt.
He's made the same mistake in essence as Nicholas II, where he's visibly taken charge and therefore will be associated with all the failings and catastrophes.
Yeah, although if we're going to play the historical parallel, I mean, rather than 1917, for me this feels more like 1904, when Russia got caught in the Russo-Japanese War that they thought was going to be a nice, victorious little war, which clearly Putin thought about Ukraine, and where not just failure, but humiliating, embarrassing failure and the huge cost thereof created this nationwide spate of local risings that was called the 1905 revolution. But it wasn't really a coherent revolution. Now, that time, there was still enough unity within the apparatus, and particularly there was Prime Minister Peter Stolypin to bring in a combination of, on the one hand, tough repression, but on the other hand, genuine reforms. But the point is, one big difference between Putin and Tsar Nicholas II is Putin is not going to allow a new Stolypin to have as much power as Stolypin did. And I don't think, you know, Putin doesn't have it in him to be a new Stolypin. So I think, again, that's the thing. It's more that the state is getting more and more brittle all the time. And so long as there's no real shock, it can survive for quite a long time. But when there is a shock, I'm not quite so sure how much resilience it'll have.
In fact, that consensus period passed, didn't it? There was a certain level of consensus with liberal economists, maybe not liberal politically, but liberal economists up till 2012. And then the security forces really started, the Siloviki started to be overrepresented within government. And as you say, very unlikely they're going to go back to prior to what happened in 2012.
Absolutely. But even the Siloviki, again, a handful of them are genuinely ideological, but a lot of them just simply are there. They're in the security apparatus because, again, that's your massive opportunities for embezzlement and corruption and you name it. But the point is, what's the point of that if you can't spend it? You know, you want to have the latest iPhone. You want to be able to go on holiday in Saint-Tropez and send your kid to a university in the UK and have all these other benefits. You know, the thoughts that basically your future is vacations in Sochi and sending your kid to the university in Shanghai is not necessarily quite so appealing.
No, and sailing your giant mega yacht there or in Murmansk or wherever is not
really round and round the Caspian Sea.
Well, Mark, it's been an absolutely incredible pleasure speaking to you. Extremely insightful. I know we're out of time, but thank you so much for giving up your precious time.
Oh, my very great pleasure. Great set of questions.
Thank you.